Okay, greetings everyone. Thank you for joining this WWF webinar on crowded places, shared spaces. I'm Ruth DeFries. I'm a professor of ecology and sustainable development at Columbia University in New York. I've had the pleasure of working with WWF India for many years through the Network for Conserving Central India. And thanks so much for the invitation to moderate this session. This series is celebrating 50 years of WWF India. If we look back on the last 50 years, conservation has focused largely on protecting spaces for wildlife, many successes, many challenges. But we're not here to talk about the past. We're here to talk about the future. The future of conservation lies in the spaces beyond protected areas into landscapes that include a matrix of forests, people, wildlife, agriculture, economic activity, infrastructure. We know that wildlife needs large spaces to move, and we also know that people need large spaces to grow food, to live, to support livelihoods, to travel. So the future of conservation is about how people and wildlife coexist across landscapes for the benefit of both. This landscape thrust of conservation brings a lot of complexity, not only about the ecology and biology of wildlife, but also social and cultural aspects of people and communities, and very difficult governance questions. We have a fantastic panel today to address this complexity, all aspects of this complexity. I'm going to introduce them all up front, and then we will get into their presentations. First, we'll have Dr. Gary Tabor, who directs the Center for Large Landscape Conservation in Montana, which means he got up very early. Thank you, Gary. He chairs the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, and he will give us an overview of landscape level conservation around the world. Dr. Ghazala Shahabuddin is an ecologist and author with the Center for Ecology Development and Research in Dehradun, and she will bring in the social dimensions of large landscape conservation. Dr. Pranav Chanchani is the national lead for tiger conservation at WWF India, and he will discuss the ecological dimensions. And finally, very importantly, Dr. Sandeep Tambe will discuss the governance dimensions of large landscape conservation. Dr. Tambe is a member of the Indian Forest Service and a professor at the Indian Institute of Forest Management in Bhopal. As we go through the presentations, please put your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button. And after all of the presentations, we will address as many of the questions as we have time for. So with that, I will hand the Zoom over to Gary.
Hi, Ruth, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And happy 50th to WWF India and all its supporters and friends. So grateful to be able to participate today from such a distance. And it is before sunrise, let me tell you. So let me start by sharing my screen. Hold on here. Can you all see that? So, my name's Gary Tabor. I live in Bozeman, Montana, about an hour and a half outside of Yellowstone National Park, the first national park in the world. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about a global crisis of unprecedented nature fragmentation. In fact, in 2019, there were record levels of habitat fragmentation all across the globe. And the reality is that when you look at large terrestrial mammals in every continent except Antarctica, they don't have room to roam. They don't have the space to feed, to find mates, to disperse, to continue on with their life cycles. And if they can't do that, they can't survive. And one of the problems, that causes this is road building. And based on certain projections, every paved road in the world is set to double by 2050. That's how fast infrastructure development is occurring around the globe, and many of it in high biodiversity countries. And people forget that roads themselves have high impact on wildlife directly. Over 100 million large mammals per year, that's not counting all the small other creatures, are killed every year in roads, and many of them very endangered. And it's certainly common in India. And so with this habitat fragmentation crisis we're seeing, we're also in parallel, obviously, if you don't have habitat, you don't have the room for species. And we're seeing a species extinction crisis. And when the world comes together and says 1 million species are at risk of extinction, what that means is that 1 million less species are interacting, providing clean air and water, providing fertile soils, recycling nutrients, sequestering carbon, providing pollination, providing the life functions that sustain all life, including ourselves on the planet. Now, as I said before, I live near Yellowstone National Park. It's the first national park created in 1872. But what people don't realize is that it's a box. And while parks have been a solution, they are not all the solutions. And when you think like a box, you start to manage ecology in perverse ways. And this is a photo of the edge of Yellowstone National Park, where on the left side is the national forest where they've cut the trees, and all the forest is left in the park. And you can see how our square thinking has led to landscape management. Of course, wild animals don't think in the box. They don't even think about boxes. And the large mammals that live in Yellowstone, like these elk, migrate widely in and outside the park. And here I call the London tube map for elk migration around Yellowstone. But as Ruth said before, the present and future of conservation is conserving all lands and all seas in and outside of parks. It's what's known as the matrix. We're not talking about the science fiction movie. We're talking about the matrix, which is the science fact, that all wildlife and all nature has to have conservation on all lands. And that's where connectivity conservation comes in. Connectivity conservation is an approach to saving nature outside of protected areas, because just like people need to be connected socially or by our own roads, nature has to be connected by nature pathways. And connectivity conservation is the conservation of ecological flows, the movement of species, and supporting the dynamic processes that sustain nature, and thus benefits all life on Earth, including people. And another way of looking at it in a health sense, if protected areas are the heart and lungs of nature, we haven't done a very good job of protecting the circulatory system of nature, because frankly, parks are not disconnected from what's going on around them. They require what's going on around them to survive. And we have to do a better job of saving the circulatory system of nature. So as the chair of the IUCN Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, I spend much of my time in all languages and all cultures trying to educate folks why connectivity is the future of conservation. It is the safety net of nature. And this past year, we just released the first ever global guidelines for connectivity conservation. And we propose doing this through two major ways: through protecting ecological corridors or biological corridors or wildlife corridors, and creating some kind of consistent definition and framework for doing so, and that those corridors add up to connecting parks in what we call large-scale ecological networks. And here's the conceptual model of what one is. So if you think about pathways or trails or roads for people to connect, nature needs that same process as well. And ecological networks are essentially building the architecture for large landscape conservation, because nature has to survive at a large scale to function. especially in a time of climate change where environmental conditions are changing. And here you see just a representation of how we might connect protected areas, other conserved areas in a landscape where people live. So we have to provide room for people to roam as well as nature. And we suggest approaches, old and new. But these days, the regulatory approaches may not be sufficient enough. In fact, they are limiting. There are various ways to use incentives or new types of land use planning or voluntary agreements with local and indigenous communities to support connectivity. There's value to where everyone lives to support this kind of process. Connectivity conservation is growing rapidly around the world. While the science has been out there for about 4 to 5 decades, in the past 15 years, this kind of practice has grown exponentially to create these corridors, to link parks, to create large-scale ecological networks. And everyone's trying to do this independently without talking to each other. And that's what we're trying to do, is make sure that we share best practices in creating a learning network. So if you think about this, I don't believe there's going to be a top-down solution for saving nature on the planet. I believe it begins with people on the ground saving nature wherever we are, whether you live in an urban environment, a rural environment, or next to wildlands. And if we can connect all this activity that's going on so rapidly around the world, perhaps we can save the planet by connecting one large landscape or seascape at a time. Thank you. Have I stopped sharing my screen? There you are. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Dr. Shahabuddin, to the social dimension.
A big hello to Ruth and Gary and my co-panelists. And a big thank you to WWF for creating this forum, which is, I think, really critical right now, a critical topic. So thank you, Gary, for putting out the larger context to this panel. My role is going to be to talk a little bit about how we can do all of this elaborate corridor building and other improvement of connectivity, keeping particularly the social dimensions in mind. Now, as I think more about this, I feel that the land sharing versus land sparing debate is important, but I'm not going to go into the debate. I'm going to talk much more about land sharing. Land sharing is basically the activity of enhancing your production landscapes capacity to support biodiversity. And I think without us really pushing this as a policy, it is really starting to happen all over the world in small and big ways. And I'm just going to share some of the concepts here that we can take forward this debate with. I think we often forget that human spaces, apart from damaging wildlife populations, also subsidize them in many ways. In countries like India, where there's a lot of permeability across the production landscape and the protected areas, we often find that large mammal populations and other species, smaller species, do depend a lot on the provisioning and the other unconscious protection that we give these species on production landscapes. And apart from that, we also damage a lot of wildlife populations. It really depends on the specific context. In addition, we don't pay enough attention to the interlinkages between the production landscapes and the cultivation landscapes. If you go back a little bit in history, I'm more familiar with northern India, so I'll give some examples here. There has been a lot of history of protecting wild boars and feeding wild boar. in the larger landscape by the royals. And this actually led to artificial increase in population of wild birds, which then would really damage people's crops and so on. And this was continued as a policy for a long time till independence. So many of these historical sort of practices kind of, the perception of these linger on and affect the way that people see wildlife and the people respond to, how they respond to wildlife. Apart from such ecological linkages, there is increasing realization that there's considerable biodiversity in use spaces as well. And I think there have been a huge number of studies over the past 2 decades looking at agroforestry, at agriculture, and other urban landscapes. So increasing number of studies on urban landscapes. So there is a lot of biodiversity in these landscapes. So what we have to look at is how and how these species exist, and what sorts of filters these urban and agricultural landscapes create for communities. And when we look at land sharing and looking at what sorts of biodiversity can actually exist and can be promoted in human landscapes, I think a huge question is tolerance, and that's where the social issues come in, the social dimensions. When we look at tolerance, just to briefly define it for people who are new to this word in the wildlife context, it's the tolerance of people to accept wild species on their private property or on the commons that they use with other people, or even in their neighborhood. And I think, in the developed world, there is a huge perception that the only kind of responses that we have in developing countries is really negative. But as you look around, you find as many cases of acceptance and nurturing of wildlife on people's own land as we have of hostile responses. Of course, the images of leopards being killed and bears being captured and so on. I mean, it all happens. There are hostile responses and there are kind responses. But what is important to understand is what really determines the response of a landowner or a wildlife neighbor, And I think that's where our ecologist or our wildlife community sort of misses out. And I've experienced this time and time again, both within India and outside, that we just don't pay enough attention to the cultural values of, communities. We for one thing, I'd like to flag that there are as many cases of tolerance and intolerance in developed and developing countries. Economics really often doesn't have a role to play. I can point out one instance of the introduction of beavers in Great Britain, for instance. It took almost 10 years, despite the fact that beavers don't do much except, they flood lands and they do affect a bit of, production. But there was a huge societal backlash towards the beavers and now ongoing backlash towards lynx in Scotland. And now we have similar things going on with the lion and cheetah in India. So apart from cultural values, we have to look at socio-economic context. Of course, people stand to lose from certain species of wildlife, and they're very much, justified in perceiving some species as much more dangerous than others. Some people will actually feed large herbivores like nilgai because of religious values, but at the same time, they will go and hunt the larger carnivores, even though the nilgai are far more destructive to their crops than to their economy. Then there's the politics of wildlife. I think in places like India, the government is seen often as callous and uncaring about the damage caused to poorer people. And so this perception really dominates a lot of responses. Very often people want to take the law into their own hands. They want to do things themselves rather than wait for, a van from the forest department showing up and then doing something about a conflict issue. So I think we need to look at the politics and we need to look at the history of this kind of perception as well. And I think social capital is really important, right? You can pay people as much money as you want as mitigation for the economic losses that they face. But unless there is some kind of social capital that is, creates cohesive communities with very clear sort of responses, will not be able to achieve much. And this has been proven by the very famous example of the snow leopards in Spiti area, where the compensatory networks really work only when there is very local monitoring of these kind of events, conflict events, and monitoring of the kind of payments that are made and so on. So these insurance programs are working because of the people and not because of any top-down sort of systems. So at the outset, I just wanted to flag these social issues, which are very much, of course, related with the ecological. And later on, we'll talk more about hows and the whys of these things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ghazala, for summarizing so succinctly these extremely complicated but absolutely critical questions for landscape conservation. And I'm sure we'll get back to many questions. Now we'll turn to Dr. Chanchani about the ecological side of large landscape conservation.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thanks, Gary and Ghazala, for setting the stage. It really sort of makes my task easier with the background that you've provided so eloquently. So I just have a few visuals to accompany a few points I want to get across. And again, I'm focusing on ecological aspects of shared spaces and crowded landscapes. I'm really going to try and pose 4 questions and provide some answers to these. And I recognize these are incomplete answers, and I think that's by design, and also by the fact that we don't have all the answers just yet. So please bear with me. The first question is, where does wildlife belong? So the word wildlife suggests that these are untamed animals of wild, untamed spaces. But increasingly, it's becoming evident that they also equally belong in other areas that are used by humans, including, for example, as these pictures from around Pilibhit Tiger Reserve in North India illustrate, in wheat fields, where both Sarus cranes, which are migratory species that comes from Eurasia, and wild tigers live among people in wheat fields and other farmlands. Now this, on the one hand, of course, there's immense challenges, but there are also exciting opportunities for conservation. And so the fact, and I think, opening remarks, Ruth said the future is, not protected areas alone, but really landscapes beyond protected areas. And she and others have done some seminal work that sort of speaks to this idea, as this figure sort of explains. So essentially, a protected area cannot be viewed in isolation. There's a variety of processes, hydrological, ecological, socio-economic, and so on, where there's interactions at multiple levels between elements of an ecosystem, between biotic and abiotic elements, between people and forests, and so on. And all of these actually played out at some larger scale than the immediate boundaries of a protected area. And this scale could include, in some cases, a part of a watershed or an entire landscape. And as we saw from the previous image, animals may well use areas well beyond protected area boundaries. And unless we have provisions to provide for their dispersal, address their life history needs and protect them, we may fail in our goals to conserve species in such areas. So having established that wildlife often requires areas beyond protected areas and occupies areas within the matrix and the larger landscape, let's try and look at how wild spaces in India have changed over the last 3 centuries or so. So, of course, these figures are quite crowded, but essentially, if you look at the figure labeled 1800 on the left, it just illustrates that back then India was, there was a lot more forest cover. The yellows on this map are rain-fed agriculture, and the blues are intensive paddy cultivation, which was essentially restricted to North India and the Tarai back then, according to this projection. And then you see over time, the green gives way to yellow as cultivation spreads, as sort of human enterprise increases, human populations grow, and forests recede. You know, certainly colonial forest operations drove this, but then we see that beyond the colonial period too, agricultural intensification has continued, has sort of become the dominant land use. And people and wildlife have shared space across this time spectrum. They shared space in the forests in the 1800s. They continue to share space in agricultural landscapes today. However, the challenges that we face now are quite unique, and things are only getting harder for a number of reasons. Gary's spoken about roads and infrastructure. And when we talk about landscapes in today's context, roads and linear infrastructure are really the elephant in the room, so to speak, because they have the potential to literally bisect wildlife habitats or disrupt animal movement pathways that might have been viable for millennia before us. And once these disruptions come into place, they fundamentally affect the dynamics of populations of species, affecting the fates of animals, but also affecting the flow of ecosystem services potentially and other factors that are important for human well-being. And this figure just makes the point that among all the nations that support tigers today, road development, projected road development in India is literally off the charts within tiger habitats in India. This study suggests that areas with high road networks have depressed the ability of wildlife habitats to sustain tigers and prey by about 20%. And that's just the current road network. So there's a direct implication on populations. If we talk about another factor, and this figure just speaks to urbanization. These are cities, the blue dots are cities that had over 200,000 people. And you see how within Asia, and particularly within India, the projection by 2025 is that increasingly cities will directly be in contact with so-called wilderness areas, impinging on spaces that are also occupied by wildlife, and the interface between humans and wildlife will become so much more fraught. So what are the implications more specifically on wildlife populations of changes that roads and urbanization and other such factors bring? And for this, I'm going to fall back on some work by one of my colleagues at WWF, Dr. Prachi Thatte. This is her doctoral research. And I think the results are both exciting and sobering. So if we look at this plot right here, along the x-axis, we have population size, and this is for tigers in a number of reserves in central India. Along the y-axis, you have an isolation index, just how isolated or connected these various sites are. And the colors on this plot represent extinction probabilities for tigers projected into the future as a function of various scenarios of land use change. So, these include increase in road infrastructure networks, increase in mining, a sort of a fence effect around parks where there's hard physical barriers that prevent the movement of animals and so on. And the results that really jump out is that if these reserves are small, BOR and TIP on the top left are two small reserves, it doesn't matter what the scenario is, tigers are expected to go extinct about a century into the future. And then on the extreme bottom right, that's Kanha Tiger Reserve. It's well connected, it's large. It's somewhat insulated to the changes that this landscape is expected to experience. And there's a lot of reserves in orange and red that have a fairly high probability of witnessing tiger extinctions. So the fact is that in a few generations, in a few human generations, the landscape will drastically and possibly irreversibly be transformed and may sustain much less wildlife than it does today. So here's another figure from another of Prachi's papers. And this just talks about how the processes that drive extinction. So in this case, we're looking at traffic volumes on roads. The numbers 1 through 7 on the x-axis represent intensity of traffic use. And the y-axis represents the resistance to animal movement or gene flow in this case. And essentially we see that we cannot really generalize the same conclusions for a variety of species, in this case for carnivores. they all will fare differently, with respect to linear infrastructure, with leopards being very sensitive even to low density or low networks of roads that cause resistance, and tigers being able to navigate smaller roads with lower traffic volume, but being limited severely by larger roads. And okay, so I'm going to move on. So the fact then is that the decisions we make about how we manage our landscapes in the coming decade will really set the stage for the future of wildlife and of human-wildlife interactions across India. Now here's, Ghazala spoke to the social dimensions of this work. I'm addressing some ecological factors here, and I think the two cannot be viewed in isolation, right? Because development planning, governance, or just the way human lives are lived out, and really these landscapes are complex socio-ecological systems, so to speak. So one way of understanding and bringing this complexity together is to view this as a complex socio-ecological system, as Eleanor Ostrom described for common pool resources in some of her seminal work. So essentially, in such a system, we might say that the landscapes that hold tigers or other species form resource systems, and the resource units within them become elements like tiger and prey populations, also elements of the vegetation and so on. And then the social system comprises of governance systems, which basically set rules that the users or actors, that's you and I and other people who share landscapes with wildlife, follow. And these actors also have their own sets of norms, beliefs, value systems that dictate and inform how they interact with their environment. So really, it's a complex interactions of all of these systems coming together that then sets the social carrying capacity, what Ghazala might have referred to as social capital, for conservation. And that perhaps determines how people respond in the face of having to share space with wildlife, whether they're tolerant, whether they're willing or have the ability to tolerate species, whether the thresholds at which they no longer tolerate or accommodate these animals in shared spaces. And I think it really sets a context for where conservation outcomes are likely to succeed or not in time to come. And just to sort of give you a real world example of how this might play out in one context. Now, these three maps are areas within and around Corbett Tiger Reserve in Uttarakhand. That's in North India. Here, agriculturists lose upward of 1,000 livestock, that's cows and buffaloes and other animals, to tigers and leopards every year. Right, that's a lot of animals that are lost. And yet, in the last decade or so, there have virtually been no cases that have come to light of retaliatory killing of tigers or leopards. Of course, it may be happening. It's something that's very hard to document, but usually if it's happening frequently, it comes to light. So the fact then is, and Corbett today also sustains some of the highest densities of these carnivores in the world today. So if conservation is working in Corbett, despite high levels of conflict with people, how is that happening? And what are the social and economic and ecological dynamics that are driving it? So these three maps show you one sort of ecological mechanism that seems to drive conflict, and that is changing vegetation cover over time. In the monsoons, as the vegetation cover grows, tigers are able to exploit this cover to move into areas where cattle graze and still remain concealed. So tigers reduce their risk of being detected or being pursued by humans and bag cattle as prey. Cattle are also exploiting, increased vegetation in the landscape. So that sort of explains how tigers navigate these landscapes of coexistence, reducing risk on the one hand, but also exploiting resources on the other. The harder question then is, how do humans tolerate, such high levels of livestock depredation? And we don't quite have all the answers, but some recent surveys that we carried out suggest that to a large extent, there's a recognition that they live in a space that has also been occupied by these large carnivores for centuries. And then these carnivores have a certain space that they're bound to eat livestock. And as long as there are certain mechanisms that recognize the duress that people face, that compensate them for it, there's a level of acceptance and tolerance that's maintained. Now, of course, this needs more investigation, but these are the sorts of stories that will determine the fates of wildlife and how conservation plays out in shared landscapes in time to come. So thanks a lot with me, and I look forward to the next session and the discussions that follow.
Okay, thank you so much, Pranav.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment.
Okay. So we'll move to Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. A very good evening to all the viewers. It's a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel, and I would like to share, I think the key point of the discussion is the constraint of space that we have. We talked of shared space and crowded space. It's this space that is in limitation. So let's unpack this space a bit more. So if you look at India, it's about rural spaces and urban spaces. So animals may venture out from the forest into rural areas, and at the same time, humans may enter into forests. So if you look at rural Indias of India, these areas are not those sleepy hamlets of yore. There is a dynamism is visible, social equations are changing, land holdings are getting fragmented, roads and mobile networks have reached our villages, cash incomes are important for the people now, and aspirations are growing. It's not just about becoming poverty free and roti kapda makan, it's also about attaining prosperity now. So people just want a pakka house, tapped water supply, electricity, a fridge and television, college education for kids, owning a vehicle. So aspirations are changing in rural India. And farmers don't want their children to take up farming, many of them. So the younger lot is often migrating to cities. So in the next 10 years, 40% of India is going to be urbanized, a population of 590 million staying in our rapidly growing cities. So this will have a differential impact on wildlife. So many rural areas, especially the remote ones in the upper reaches of the Himalayas, may actually get less crowded, and there might be more space for nature. And nature may get a chance to come back, like we saw in those COVID videos. The human footprint may actually reduce in some of these areas. At the same time, the urban areas are going to expand very fast, and many of our protected areas and natural scapes near cities and towns, they are going to come under immense pressure. So there would be instances of land grabbing, encroachment, conversion of land use, animal movement will get restricted. So I think its time has come to prioritize and focus on these protected areas adjacent to our urban areas, which are going to come under increasing pressure from migrating rural people in search of jobs. So let us also look back at how do we typically reduce our wildlife numbers or prevent wildlife, and how do we often reduce the space available to them. Many times we have instances we just hunt down the animals, we keep their populations down, that's how we manage. And the only space we share with animals often is on our dining plate. I'm sure many of us would have come across these beautiful dense forests, but they are eerily silent. Sometimes we hear stories about poisoning and electrocution of animals when they venture out. And at the same time, we also know that in some places, there is so much pressure to declare animals as vermin, and professional hunters are actually employed to kill animals. We have seen these stories in the past. Many times we have also tried translocating animals to other forests, zoos nearby. These are some of the traditional approaches that we have seen. What I would like to share in today's discussion is more about some of the successes. In spite of all these constraints that we face, there are few successes that merit attention, and maybe we can draw out some lessons from these successes. The first case that I would like to draw your attention is the Gujarat lion. Lion is a charismatic species, and we have seen an expanding lion population over the last decade. Not only have the numbers increased by 50%, but even the area that the lion occupies now in this western state of Gujarat has increased by 50%. And we haven't heard many negative stories about lions impacting humans or the other way around. So as the pride expands to a new area, it starts residing in the scrub forest next to the village, and a proactive forest department provides assurance that cattle kills will be speedily compensated with adequate compensation. And many places, in fact, villagers have reported that the earlier problem that they used to have regarding wild boars, nilgai numbers, those problems have come down. So I think this is a very good example. And one of the main reasons why this is happening is because there is a pride in Gujarat about their land. There is a political will towards saving it, and also the behavior of the land and the people of Gujarat, they're not really aggressive towards each other. So I think these factors combine to a very unique situation where a large carnivore has expanded 50% of its territorial area, and still we are not seeing too much of conflict. Same landscape, same road network, increasing infrastructure, all those constraints are there, but still we find some beautiful coexistence story in this part of Gujarat. The second example that I would like to take you is in South India, near the city of Coimbatore in Kerala, where we have elephants. So this is the Valparai Hills in Western Ghats. It's a 200 square kilometer landscape, which was historically a rainforest, but was then cleared and planted with tea and coffee. So in this landscape, around 100 elephants in 3 herds migrate in search of better habitats. And there were earlier instances of human deaths and rural people getting in conflict, and there was a lot of conflict that was coming up in these areas. New innovation that happened here was researchers actually studied this problem. Why are these encounters happening? When are they happening? What are the patterns behind them? Can we reduce them? And they realized that these encounters were happening because people, when they were returning from the bus stop, after going outside the village, when they were returning from the bus stop, they chanced upon these elephants. The elephants didn't know the humans were coming. The humans were not aware about the elephant presence. So they devised an advanced warning system, and they could alert people about a herd presence in their village using bulk SMS, flashing lights, and this brought down the chance encounters as people became more alert. So this is also a good example. Wildlife and people are sharing the landscape. Their numbers are increasing, but technology is alerting the people and preventing these encounters from happening. So I think this is also a good example where humans and animals can share a landscape, and we can alert humans of presence of animals so that the conflict can be reduced. The third quick example that I would like to share is about leopards near Mumbai, which is one of India's largest metropolitan city. So you have a unique setup where you have got high-rise residential complexes right next to a national park at the outskirts of the metro city. And leopards are the apex predator in this park. And this place was often in the news earlier because of conflicts between leopards and the city dwellers. That was the time when a unique project called Project Vaghova or Project Leopard was envisaged, and it developed a synergy between the park, the people, and the leopard. So before the project started, researchers actually went into the root cause of the problem. Why are the leopards venturing into the residential complexes? Where are the chance encounters happening? And they found out that while there was sufficient prey base in the park, the presence of easy prey like dogs was attracting these animals. So they got the whole community together. They got the municipality to light up the area better management of solid waste, garbage bins. Residents started taking precautions during night time. There were do's and don'ts for the community. School children were made aware. Police support was sought for crowd control. Forest department developed better rapid response capabilities and equipments to take care of eventualities. Media management was done so that instead of portraying the animal as something very cruel and intent on preying on young children, there was much more responsible media reporting that happened, and this all was a collective effort. So if you look at these three stories, whether it's a leopard or the elephant or the lion, they may venture out once in a while, but at the same time, wildlife problems in India are still more complex. We have some animals like nilgai, monkeys, and others who perpetually stay in human-dominated landscapes, and this is not an easy problem to deal with. We have tried out animal birth controls, but we have not met with much successes. Even when we try to control the dog population in cities, which is much easier, we haven't met with much success. But probably I think one of the ways would be to have more effective animal birth controls using humane methods. So to summarize, the common threads that I wanted to highlight was in a specific context of a human-wildlife conflict, we need to understand the problem better. And there is a role of science in better informing practice. What is the reason behind animals venturing out? What are the patterns that are emerging? When are the conflicts happening? Where are they happening? Who gets attacked? Now, the second step is, can we prevent these conflicts from happening by better warning system, having a code of conduct, taking some preventive steps like garbage management, better street lighting, etc. And finally, I feel the solution has to be a collaborative solution. Various departments, stakeholders have to come together. whether it is the municipality, the police department, civil society, media, action research, they all need to own up to this problem and contribute. Whether it is the Gram Panchayats, district administration, municipalities, all have a role to play. Unlike, I often see that people portray this wildlife as if they are owned by the forest department. You hear these stories in the newspapers कि वन विभाग का तेंदुआ गांव में आ गया, कि जंगलात वालों का बाघ शहर में घुस गया. So you feel as if it's only a responsibility of the forest department to manage these animals. I think the solution will be more towards collective efforts, which will result in more chances of success than the model that we see wherein forest department faces the flak alone and tries to solve this problem alone. So I think collaboration is the way forward. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandeep, and particularly thank you for sharing some success stories, which are very inspiring.
Thank you.
So we've heard from all of our speakers about the complexities of the future for conservation in large landscapes, and we have a lot of very good, insightful questions, and I'm going to try to club them together and pull out some of the main points from the questions. So one question, and I'm going to start with Pranav. Your mission is tiger conservation. And the question here is the conservation sector willing to share space with people?
I guess that question can be understood in a variety of ways. Ruth, what's your understanding of it? I'm going to.
Okay. Well, I'll just make a comment and come back to you. Yeah. Okay. So I have seen over the last, I'd say maybe 10, 15 years that I've been lucky enough to be interacting with the conservation world in India, that there has been a massive shift from thinking about conservation like Yellowstone was first thought of fences, of keeping people out, of opposing every road, of just opposing, being against anything that other sectors might want to do. And there's been an enormous transformation in recognizing that development is important for people. Without the support of people, there will not be conservation. And how to think about conservation in terms of accommodating what people need and achieving the goals of conservation. So I've just witnessed that very large, I think, change in the worldview.
Right, and if I might add to that, I think that's a good way to approach it for sure. I think that transformation is ongoing in the conversations we have every day among conservation circles and beyond. And just to give you a few examples of how this plays out in a few contexts. So, I think for the longest time, there was a thrust, an emphasis on creating reserves, right? And this is viewed as the one model to protect wildlife. And certainly it's done a lot of good for tigers and other species in India. And I think if nothing else is, I think, growing recognition at various levels that land use types beyond these reserves still support viable populations of tigers and other species. The mechanisms for this are not always understood or well acknowledged. But the fact is, I think, there's growing evidence that we don't really understand what human disturbance is, how it plays out in different circumstances, and the conditions under which animals may be tolerant of certain forms of so-called disturbance, and may be able to co-adapt with humans in these spaces. And I think that creates a lot of opportunities for conservation. In terms of sort of the legal paradigm, the introduction of concepts such as community reserves and conservation reserves, which really sort of expand the boundaries of traditional protected areas to be more inclusive of communities, creates the room for conservation in spaces that are shared. So I think And that certainly comes to mind right off the bat.
So Ghazala, from the social perspective, do you think that the conservation sector is ready to share?
I think that the conservation sector is ready to share. I think, as both of you have mentioned, there's a lot that has changed, and you can see it in the programs. I think what has to change is the kind of importance that government gives to these instances. I know that Sandeep has mentioned some examples where, definitely forest department in isolated places has been really proactive to particular incidents or particular situations. But I think that we are lacking large policy paradigms in which we can actually actualize these kind of situations. I can give you one small example. Now, it is very well known in the part of the India where I work, in the Western Himalayas. It's very well known that subsistence farming and the kind of forest management that's going on is extremely beneficial to birds and to smaller animals, mammals, as well as a large variety of biodiversity, right? And there is an ongoing crisis there. There's an agrarian crisis. The government has singularly failed to respond to this large-scale agrarian crisis, which can actually result in large-scale abandonment of this area. And abandonment of land in the Western Himalayas is not going to be good. We're going to lack people who will conserve these areas and the biodiversity. There are a large number of studies, including one from Princeton, showing the large role that agriculture plays in Himalayan biodiversity. Yet, our fund of CAMPA has not even started one program in which such kinds of informal or even large-scale endangered species protection is being compensated in any way. We have, I just did a calculation, a $7.3 billion fund, which has been created out of the compensatory payments made by various industries and government to the central government for compensating for the forest loss that has been the loss of forest due to these infrastructure and industrial development, right? This is 54,000 crore rupees, $7.3 billion. I have yet to see a large-scale state-level program or policy that actually incorporates, biodiversity conservation on production landscapes. I'm sorry, it's sad, but and I've not even seen this. We've got 10 endangered species programs, but none of them has any sort of this kind of policy built in.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we have some questions that go from the other direction, asking about what actions are needed from other sectors. So for you, Sandeep, from the perspective where you sit at IAFM, do you see that other sectors, for instance, the highways and rail and agriculture, rural development, have taken on board the need for large landscape conservation?
I think a lot needs to be done in this field because typically when we talk of conservation, it seems like it's the onus of the forest department. And actually it needs to be mainstreamed across different departments and ministries to have that impact at the landscape level, because it is these other ministries like maybe the roads, mining, transport, agriculture, irrigation, who may be having a larger impact when we talk of production landscapes. So we still have to develop those integrated plans outside our natural landscapes. So this particular piece I think is missing right now, wherein we do prepare our district plans at the district level, but probably there is need for better integration, a larger voice for species in these plans. Right now these plans are more about people, they're more about infrastructure, more about human well-being. So probably these plans need to create some kind of space for animals as well when they venture into the human space. So I think that piece is missing, and there is a need for greater sensitization towards the line ministries so that their activities, their programs also embed sustainability in their plans and in the design of their infrastructure.
Thank you. For Gary, we have, or anyone, we have quite a few questions about infrastructure and whether underpasses, overpasses, these kinds of structures that mitigate to maintain connectivity, how effective they can be, and how much of the solution can we rely on from those kinds of engineering measures?
Well, first I'll say that when people think about green infrastructure, they think about how buildings in cities have advanced to use certain materials, be built in more ecological ways, reduce their energy. We have not applied that thinking to civil engineering for roads and rails yet. I think that's for future engineers out there, we could use your creativity right now, because this sector of engineering is behind the other sectors with regards to greening how they build roads and rails, how they site themselves, what materials they use, more low carbon, how they work with features in the environment, ecological flows like animal movement. I tell people that these underpasses and overpasses are tragically great ideas. Tragic in the sense that these roads and rails have become Berlin walls to biodiversity. They've really cut up nature to the point where nature can't function well. And then we build these structures. Sometimes we build them without even knowing the ecology, where the animals are moving, because it's some spec that an engineer has got without talking to an ecologist. And what we also know is that they're not building them, frequently enough. A lot of times we'll see this one grand underpass or overpass and think the problem is solved. But in reality, if you don't have some kind of crossing structure every kilometer, that's really the frequency you need, then you're really not doing much for permeability of the landscape. But you might have these icons, these white elephants, if you will, of construction.
Thank you. Ghazala, your remarks about the respect that people have for wildlife in India has raised quite a few questions, and I could say one of my inspirations from working in India is how much people respect, value wildlife, live with wildlife, and it is very, very inspiring. And Sandeep, you mentioned about the change in aspirations for rural livelihoods. So Ghazala, do you see that kind of tolerance is changing? Is it something that we can rely upon to continue into the future, or not?
I think it would be wrong to sort of generalize across such a diverse country as India, not only geographically, but also, economically, and, we harbor so many different faiths and so many different groups, ethnicities. So I think it's really hard to say. And of course, in most cases, rural turning urban is giving rise to a lot of issues, especially when you have these images of leopards and other errant animals coming into villages that are slowly developing, and people don't have the awareness. But on the other hand, you also have a lot of images of people going and trying to save an elephant that has sort of slipped into one of the trenches, and people struggling for 48 hours to drag out the elephant. So it's really a country of contradictions, in many ways. And I personally think that there's a lot of variation. Having traveled to a few other countries and studied the situation there, I do feel that India is really blessed to have a very inborn sort of a tolerance that is really hard to break in many ways. I think that there is a strong feeling. I know it sounds a bit romantic, and I know that people like Sandeep, who've got far more interaction with local communities, have also seen a lot of variety of situations. But, you know, talking to the common villager, talking to even now, you know, urban bird watchers who try to put out, you know, some trees into their balcony so that birds can come in and feed off of the nectar. You know, I think that there is a growing, on the one hand, there are a lot of people demanding more out of the land. And yet, on the other side, you have people who are growing these small forests, putting a lot of effort, letting their land grow to forest, you know, creating corridors and green rooftops, you know. So I think it's very hard to generalize.
Yeah. Sandeep, do you have any comments on that? And there's also maybe comment on another question, which is about how to build agency and space for communities, community involvement in protecting their wildlife.
Yeah. I think it also has to do, our strategy also has to do with how much we love wildlife. If you love wildlife a lot, you would try to have multiple safeguards in place. Communities respect wildlife. That is great, but it may not work all the time. So you would also like to have situations wherein you create a political will. Like we saw the whale shark example in Gujarat, wherein this whale shark was hunted, and there was a whole movement that was created that whale shark is like a daughter who's coming to Gujarat and you need to save the whale shark. It was upgraded in the Wildlife Protection Act. It was religious leaders came and they portrayed whale shark as something we need to protect. So we need to try diverse approaches to save wildlife, not hoping that one will work. So even the rhino, if you see the position that the rhino has in the northeastern state of Assam, it has got a political pride just like the lion has. So I guess we need to have multiple approaches so that we are sure that at least one will work, if not more of them, to save our wildlife. Yeah, the second question that you talked of about, how do we involve communities? So I think that is the key point, because forest departments alone would not be able to do it as animals venture into human-dominated landscapes. So that is the point where I feel especially civil society can play a rallying role, wherein they can get different stakeholders together, the academicians, forest departments, municipalities, get all of them together. It may be difficult for forest department to play that role because it's essentially a top-down regulatory agency who enforces the law. So a much more open, free civil society could lead the show, like it happened in Borivali, it happened in Gujarat. So a civil society is better positioned to act like the fulcrum to get all stakeholders together and build on the strengths of all these agencies. So I think there is a role for civil society to act like a magnet, attracting all stakeholders to focus on wildlife conservation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that fits with Gary's points about one landscape at a time. So we have a lot of questions about the other side of the tolerance, which is the conflict, the human-wildlife conflict. So as there's success in landscape conservation, there's also the increase in the potential for conflict. So I'll turn again to Pranav. There's quite a few questions on this topic. So how do you see what's needed to manage that potential increase in conflict? You're muted.
Oops, thanks. So I think at many levels, conflict management comes down to risk management, and that's managing risk both for wildlife and for humans, right? So we need to make sure that the risk of wildlife getting killed in these shared spaces is low enough to not impact populations and so on, or demographic processes, but also that communities are not thrown under the bus, so to speak, that that they are cared for, that the risk that wildlife poses to their lives, to their livelihoods, is recognized and duly addressed. And I think that's immensely challenging, because if we look at human-wildlife conflict as a whole, it includes everything from snakes that might come and claim your life, and of course there are a lot of people who died to snake bites in India every year, to the ubiquitous monkey that is found in most Indian cities and creates havoc. And of course, the rarer but more sort of prominent conflict with tigers and elephants, which is a reality in many landscapes. And in terms of managing risk, as landscapes change, as they get more crowded, as the interface becomes more fraught, I think a variety of approaches, and just borrowing from something Sandeep said, are needed. So on the one hand, you need to understand where conflict occurs. Are there certain spaces in which conflict occurs over and over again? Are these venues attracting wildlife for one reason or another? Are there spaces where humans are more vulnerable? If so, you prioritize actions there. And I think there's some hard decisions that need to be made, because such spaces may be viable for wildlife or may not be viable. They may be attractive to wildlife, but that doesn't necessarily mean that wildlife can be sustained there. So then there are hard decisions about removing animals, about erecting fences. And I think, certainly technology comes to the table. I think effective strategies that are comprehensive to address conflict before it really spills out of hand need to be put in place at a district level in such areas. And ultimately, I think all these efforts cannot succeed till we're also working on sort of with society, with communities, to create space for errant wandering wildlife, because this is bound to happen now and then. And if the odd tiger reaches, the Dungs or reaches South Bengal, can we really create a mechanism that supports the presence of these animals for some duration of time or for longer durations of time? And that's a hard question, but I think the efforts start here now. They start regionally. There needs to be national policy, but a lot of local action by the coming together of many actors. So thanks. That's my long-winded answer.
Yeah. Gary, do you have any comments from other places around the world? Yellowstone, the area around Yellowstone has a lot of conflict. Of course, India is a very, very different situation with small-scale farmers whose crops get raided and many, many people who are subject to human-wildlife conflict. But you might have some comments about learnings from other places.
Well, I think that, what Ghazala said about the tolerance that India has, we don't have in the United States. And we wish we had the tolerance to other species and the recognition of the sentience of other species is not as great here. For us in the United States and other parts of the world, sometimes wildlife represent other values. It's not the wildlife that's in conflict. It's because the wildlife represent government control or a disconnection of rights. And so the conflicts, wildlife are sadly used as proxies for other societal challenges. And we have to get people to understand and move away to look at wildlife for wildlife reasons, not because it represents some other element of society or dislocation or disconnection, if you will, with other society things. So it is, but the process of tolerance is a learned process. I mean, it is for many communities, and this goes back to one of your first questions, Ruth, is that are people part of nature or not part of nature? I think there's been a poor education of how we live with nature in our society as a whole. And I tell people that conservation, you got to think of conservation like your health. You're responsible for your health. I mean, you can have a doctor who can advise you, but in general, it's your true responsibility. We have to think of conservation as part like your health. You're responsible for conservation. We live on this planet, we share this planet, we use its resources, and we have to understand that we're part of it. So when we look at tolerance, we have to look at ourselves in this conversation. And if you think of yourself as separate from nature, yeah, then there's going to be conflict. But if you think of yourself in other ways, then I think you're going to be more open and empathetic.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many good questions and comments in the Q&A. I'm trying to pull out the main themes. So thank you all for those questions. Thank you, the people who are listening. There's quite a few comments about how to create the education and appreciation and inspiration that's needed to support landscape conservation. Ghazala, you probably have thought a lot about that in your writings.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's some new movements that have come about, and I think it's playing a huge role in creating support for nature in all sorts of unlikely places. So I think, for instance, in India, the citizen science programs that are going on, they just inspiring people to protect nature wherever you see it, to understand, to learn. And some of, in our own program in the Western Himalaya, we have started similar programs with rural youth who don't have the kind of, the exposure that city kids have. And it's amazing to find how much acceptance there is and how much learning there is, even at the rural level. So I think these kind of citizen science programs are playing a huge role in creating awareness, sensitizing people. And sometimes I think we think that village people don't understand nature. Many a time you find that they're far more better understanding of the ecology of their surroundings as well as the wildlife around them compared to us. So I think there's a strong base that we have, and I think we have to build upon it with science-based programs.
Yeah, thank you. Sandeep, you might have some comments. You had mentioned the urbanization, which changes people's views of the world, and what's needed to cultivate appreciation for landscapes.
Yeah, I am seeing a very welcome change in the way the school education is being done in India. My generation grew up with as cruel as a tiger, as cunning as a fox, as greedy as a pig. So we were taught most of these negative values about humans, about animals. And when I see my son's school books, I find a lot has changed, and the amount of space that's given to environment, forest, wildlife has really improved. At the same time, I feel one sector which is very important is media education, because most of the common people in urban areas may not get the pleasure of visiting wildlife areas and looking at animals firsthand. So the opinion they form about wildlife is from what they listen to in the media. And media is omnipresent. It has entered all our bedrooms now. So the way they project the animal is the way people form opinions about it. So they may portray a leopard who has strayed into a wildlife area as someone who has come hunting for human and maybe young children. So we need to ensure that we don't get into the sensationalism that is created by the media, but educate media of the sensibilities and not to create a very attractive media story that can have very high TRP ratings. So I think while the school education bit is improving a lot, the media education part is something which is very important, because that is what seems to be forming public opinion nowadays. And public opinion plays a very big role in the way the decision makers take their decisions. So I think this bit has to be emphasized. Yeah.
Okay, we're coming towards the end, and we still have a lot of questions, but one of the some of the questions relate to what types of collaborations are needed. So we're talking in the future, large landscape conservation. This is not conservation as it has been in the past. So that means different collaborations, different sectors working together towards solutions that benefit both people and wildlife. So it's a sea change in the way we think about conservation. So I wanted to ask all of your views on that question in the last few minutes about what are the steps forward in the collaborations, the critical actions that are needed to be able to share space moving forward. And I think we'll go in the order that we had the presentation. So Gary.
Well, first of all, I want to let you know that sharing across cultures is very important. And for those of you who know this guru from India, Sadhguru, he's now riding his motorcycle right now today through Yellowstone National Park. So so we have a whole contingent of Indian leaders following him through Yellowstone, and the connection across cultures is great. But I'll step back. Look, conservation and conversation. They're two words that sound alike, but they're two words that have deep meaning. Is that, you know, connecting people? That's why I like connectivity conservation, because you connect people to connect nature. You have to talk to each other. In a world where social media now, I have young people who don't know how to make a phone call anymore. Everything's on email. They're indirect communicators. They don't even sit down and talk with people. But conservation is about building trust. And trust comes with conversation. And I believe that has to happen across cultures. Now, where we have such cultures in my part of the world who historically have issues, and they can be competing land use issues. It can be historical aspects of tribes versus cowboys, literally. We have what we call the 80-20 rule. We bring people together to talk about how, because they're all dealing with water management. They're all dealing with wildlife conflict. They're all dealing with invasive species. They're all dealing with these issues that are bigger than themselves. And how are we going to get them to work together? Well, we say, talk about the 80% of things you can work on, and the 20% of things which you cannot talk about, and it's usually about politics, you know, leave it, because there's so much more that brings us together than separates us. So conversation is the big starter for us.
Thank you. Zala.
So I think the three big things that are required now, which may or may not be collaborative. One is just better land use planning, particularly in developing countries. We've got to figure out how much land we can actually spare for nature and how much land we can share with nature. And we really don't have any, any stability. Land uses are changing from one to another without any kind of monitoring, without any control. I think so. We need that soon. The other thing is ecological design. A number of speakers have talked about the infrastructure and about various kinds of planning for wildlife. I think everything has to happen with ecological designs. I was really struck by a presentation by the Singaporean National Park director, who just showed two slides. One was a stormwater drain, like you always have in India or any other country, simple drain with cemented sides carrying water out of a particular area whenever there is a rainstorm. And the other design was a meandering kind of a stormwater drain without cemented sides, with reeds, rushes, frogs, mosquitoes, everything. So the same function is being served for the human beings, but one has 50 times more biodiversity than the other. So can we creatively think of ecological design, particularly in the cities? A number of speakers have talked about urbanization taking over our lives. So unless we do this sort of ecological design, we will be left with very little in our large urban spaces. And I think the third thing that I got through this program and through my own, we need programs, we need policies. I was just looking up various programs that have been successful in other countries. We have the Hedgerows and the Boundaries Grant Program in UK, which, where they encourage and they give incentives to people to maintain hedgerows of a certain design. And these hedgerows support as many as 80% of woodland birds and 30% of butterflies, according to the RSPB. So this is a simple thing, and people are being paid or not paid or being encouraged in different ways to do these hedgerows. Another is a safe harbor program for red-cockaded woodpeckers in the longleaf pine savannas of eastern United States. Now, again, people are paid to keep the habitat in a way that provides refuge for the red-cockaded woodpecker. So I think we have some lessons to learn from some of these programs, and I think we need to start designing and adopting these in India as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Pranav.
So when I think of land use in India and all the issues around shared spaces and trying to extend the conservation portfolio beyond protected areas and forests. It's literally like standing under a waterfall with your mouth open. It's overwhelming. And I think the first thing that needs to happen is sort of a unity among conservation groups, among agencies that are tasked with conservation. And that goes back to your first question of, is conservation really ready to sort of embrace these multi-use landscapes and so on. And I think there's two very important opportunities to do that. The most important at this moment, and I think we're largely missing the bus on that, is to do with eco-sensitive zones around our protected areas in India. That's the one legal and policy instrument there is to extend conservation into the matrix, into human land use types that can actually have a bearing on the fates of species within these PAs, on connectivity, potentially on how conflict is managed, on creating incentives and disincentives to sort of run conservation programs that can deliver positive outcomes. And we're largely failing because for the most part, the kinds of eco-sensitive zones that are being described because of varying political and other pressures are trivial compared to the needs of a space. Sometimes a few hundred meters, sometimes a kilometer. And so I think this is a huge lost opportunity, not without its challenges, but I think there's need for collaboration and unity among groups that back each other, that support each other with information and data and so on, and that work with the government and communities to remove misinformation around ESZs and help with more effective planning. So that's one. And the other, I think, in general, I think your opening comment, Ruth, was that it really struck me, and it's something I've been thinking about very actively. So the future of conservation is looking outwards. And I still think that a lot of us remain focused on protected areas and so on, and rightfully so, because there's a lot at stake. But given the rate of change in these landscapes, I think in 10 years from now, the conversation will move forward so fast, a lot of opportunities we have today will be precluded and off the table by then. So it is to really come together and drive land use policy in India, whether it's a district at a time, a state at a time, a taluk at a time, do what we can to push the government, to work with the government, to work with communities, and to evolve policy before it's too late.
Thank you. Sandeep.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I saw, which is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge over the last decade, is positions are hardening in India. Academicians, civil society, activists, government departments, we are not having conversations like Gary said, as we used to have maybe a couple of decades back. And there is a kind of perceptions that we have created that forest departments are about animals and park, and activists would be talking about people, researchers would be worried about their publications. So we have, without having conversations, created these barriers amongst us. And without having the conversation, we perceive or we, in a way, anticipate the position of the other stakeholder. So I think we have to break these barriers, because without breaking these barriers, we are only creating hatred, and finally wildlife is suffering. So I think it would be great if we could create these spaces in India, other than the spaces we are talking of. These are spaces where we can deliberate, we can come together, and also realize that we are not as different as we make ourselves out to be. We are all the same species. And this debate that is there in India about tribals versus tiger, people versus the park, these debates have become very heated, and it is preventing good collaboration. So I would say my dream is to get all stakeholders together. And wherever you see in India, there are success stories, whether it is the Amur falcon in Nagaland, the leopard in Borivali, the whale shark in Gujarat, the elephant in Valparai. It's all about the civil society movement, the government departments, the media, the school children, all of them coming together. So I think this is the divide, and this is the barrier we need to break. And these are the spaces that we need to create a meeting of minds, so that we can address this issue together. So this unity and working together is what is my dream.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to propose one more lightning round for the key message that you would like the participants who are here with us on this webinar to take away from this session and to think about going forward. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to think about your lightning round final remark. And again, follow the same, or well, maybe we'll reverse it. Sandeep, that's so unfair to you, but we'll reverse it.
Yeah, a quick remark from my side. Let's do it together.
Oh, beautiful.
So a couple very quickly.
Oh yeah, Pranav, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the time's come to spell out a bold land use policy for India. We may succeed, we may fail, but the vision needs to be there, and they're good templates. So collectively, let's put our head together and try and do that.
Great. Ghazala.
I just have 3 words that I keep repeating: science, equity, and sustainability. I think we need to move forward with all 3 in equal measure and sincerely.
I want to say to all the people who are listening live and to all the people who will hear this recording, this can't be done just by us. We need you, and we want to, help you can work with us to do this. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And I will close out this webinar by congratulating WWF India once again on its 50 years, and for this is what we need. We need institutions that are nimble to be able to evolve with changing circumstances and seeing the rapid land use conversion and the change in the approaches towards conservation, to be able to address those the way WWF has done in the past, along with collaborating with other organizations to move into the future. So I will thank everyone, all the participants, for joining this webinar, congratulating WWF once again. And I believe there are a lot more interesting webinars in this 50th year series. So thank you, Gary, Ghazala, Pranav, Sandeep, and thanks to all of you for joining.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Ruth.